Hi, Daniel Wincott again. This presentation provides an overview of trade policy rights and the environment. Unsurprisingly, the main aim of trade agreements is to increase trade. It generally leads to economic growth. Increased trade typically creates winners and losers. Although it doesn't always happen, economic growth makes compensating losers possible. Free trade agreements, which try and reduce barriers to trade between the countries that agree them, also try and influence who wins and loses from trade through shared minimum standards to stop firms reducing workers' rights to gain a competitive advantage, including incentives for some aspects of trade and the economy, and setting out broad policy goals and aspirations. If we think about trade agreements as having an economic core, they also often include other elements to do with labor rights and workers' rights, to do with fighting gender inequality and promoting non-discrimination, protecting the environment, combating climate change, transparency, and political participation. For example, the UK-Australia agreement made recently has elements on low carbon, climate change, the environment, gender equality and access to trade, how UK-Australia trade impacts on developing nations and on labour protections. And we need to ask whether trade policy is a good tool for achieving these broader objectives at home or around the world. If we look at trade patterns, high-income countries trade extensively with each other. They also tend to have stronger human rights regimes, but they also rely heavily on trade with countries like China and, at least until recently, with Russia, despite worries over human rights violations in those places. So if we look at the pattern of human rights protections, we see that they tend to be higher. This is only one indicator, but higher in North America and Europe, in Australia, some parts of Latin America as well, but lower in Russia, particularly in China, which produces a huge amount of goods consumed around the world, in some parts of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and then in Africa. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western Europe relied heavily on its gas and oil. Nonetheless, it acted after the invasion to curtail this trade. This is one example of how other objectives can trump the economics benefits of trade for high-income countries. And we can think about how that might play out in other kinds of contexts as well. So thinking about rights, the environment, trade, and the global economy, some people argue that introducing rights requirements and environmental standards into trade policy could hamper economic development in poor countries, and also ask whether high-income countries should impose their own standards and values elsewhere in the world. High-income countries can place human rights and labor preconditions on trade with lower middle-income countries. A lot of high-income countries are also concerned to combat climate change, not just at home, but also looking to minimize the carbon emissions on products that they import from other parts of the world. But if we look at the patterns of carbon emissions, it's clear that high-income countries still have much higher CO2 emissions per head than countries in the global south. High-income countries need to stop exporting their carbon emissions to others. On the other hand, some of the mechanisms for doing that can end up serving to protect their domestic producers at the expense of international producers. So there's a trade-off or a balance to be struck there. And that raises some broader questions about how trade policy should be used to promote wider global aims. How far should rich countries impose human rights and environmental conditions on trade with middle and low-income countries? Should they stop exporting their emissions of CO2, for example, to lower-income countries? And are trade strategies the best way of doing that? Or should they concentrate on other policies that support trade strategy, e.g. generous technology transfers alongside policies on climate change? Also, if high-income countries focus on getting domestic policy right, they can improve the coherence of policy across trade policy and what they're doing at home to achieve the objectives they want to get to. And that can prevent them putting greater costs on international suppliers than domestic suppliers, which is an example of discriminatory effect of trade policies. I hope this presentation has raised some interesting questions for you to discuss in the next part of this session. Thank you so much for your interest and attention.